Hey, Flesh, what's up? It's the Culture Detective here investigating your favorite albums, and today I'm going to finally finish up my Pink Floyd album review series. And I will be doing a mini albums review video, except on this video, I will be talking about the last four studio albums from the one and only band Pink Floyd. Certainly one of the most innovative bands of history, and also one of my favorite bands, one of the most important bands in my musical experience as well. And yeah, I'm also kind of impressed that I'm able to cover all of Pink Floyd's studio albums in 1 month. So that's pretty cool. So yeah, Pink Floyd, they have come a long way. They are formed in the mid of the 1960s in UK, and they started off with their baroque pop slash folk roots on The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and with the exit of Syd Barrett due to mental illness, we have a saucer full of secrets where Syd Barrett sort of shows up in the last track, but the rest of the album is sort of David Gilmour, Roger Waters, Richard Wright, and Nick Mason, the Pink Floyd quartet. And their second studio album is already a very experimental and very strange meditative album, and it sort of continues on. We have Uma Guma, which is the most confusing and also the weakest Pink Floyd album, in my opinion. It's extremely experimental. A lot of the tracks have no structure whatsoever, and I feel like they have sort of prioritized experimentation over just song quality, maybe a little too much. And then they sort of headed towards a more psychedelic style with Atom Heart Mother, which I still think is super duper underrated, as well as Metal, which has more of a melancholic vibe. Again, the track Echoes is fantastic. And then we move over to the Big Four. The Big Four, four very amazing, innovative, near perfect albums. The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall. And then afterwards we have their last four records. Starting off, we have The Final Cut, which is released in the year 1983. And this is a very strange album because during the recording of The Wall, Richard Wright was fired. Yeah, Richard Wright, very important keyboardist, sings a little bit himself as well, fired from the band, and that is due to I'm sorry if I'm wrong, I'm sorry if I'm mistaken, but it was due to a bit of a quarrel between Roger Waters and Richard Wright, because again, if you can recall The Wall is actually a very Roger Waters centric album. Roger Waters provide most of the vocals on the album, and as far as song ideas go, Roger Waters is pretty much in charge. And so, while I really enjoyed The Wall, it's very Roger Waters centric, and I also agree with that statement. So, given that Richard Wright is fired, and Roger Waters wants to continue with making music under the name of Pink Floyd, we have The Final Cut, which is actually more like a Roger Waters solo album than a Pink Floyd album, in my opinion. Because The Final Cut is essentially about war, but more like Roger Waters' dad passing away in the war, and how that incident alone inspired the entire album. So yeah, every single track is basically about war. It's like a movie soundtrack. And there are a lot of tracks that are half spoken word, half sung, with very bland instrumentals. Nick Mason also didn't show up on this album all that much because there aren't that many drums on this album. The sound effects are there, so Nick Mason was doing the sound effects for the album. David Gilmour is also nowhere to be found on the album. Well, not exactly, because he did provide some vocal work for the album once in a while, but really, this album is 95% Roger Waters. And yeah, the tracks, they aren't really all that great or anything. Not a single track blew my mind, and not a single track really interested me. There are a few good songs though. I enjoyed Not Now John, which is one of the more aggressive cuts on the album, and it has flavor, it has life, and I also really like the tracks The Gunner's Dream as well as the title track. I think they're good ballads with really compelling chords. But tracks like Fletcher Memorial Home and When the Tigers Broke Free kind of sound like, I don't know, singing on top of a movie soundtrack. Like you force yourself to sing on top of a track that doesn't even need singing. And especially the latter, When the Tigers Broke Free, which sounds like a very dramatic war-themed sort of song. But yeah, overall, kind of disappointing. Kind of disappointing, feeling like a 5, like a strong 5 out of 10 on this album. And then afterwards, we have A Momentary Lapse of Reason in the year 1987. And this is a huge, huge change up for Pink Floyd because in the year 1985, Roger Waters had left the band, and Richard Wright had returned to the band. So now it's only David Gilmour, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright, the trio. And yeah, given that Roger Waters is gone, we don't have the very wild, eccentric tone anymore. But given that Richard Wright is back and that David Gilmour is more in charge, we have a more icy and more melancholic tone to their music. One thing about A Momentary Lapse of Reason is that it doesn't have focus. It just feels kinda all over the place. I mean, there really isn't any concept on the album, or at least I don't see any obvious concept from this album. Rather, we have instrumental tracks, and then we have a few big songs, we have a few small experimental songs, and they sort of combine together to form one album. And that being said, I think this album is incredibly underrated because there are actually a good handful of songs on this album that I enjoy a lot. Of course, the album intro, Signs of Life, while it's not a very interesting sounding intro, I really, really like the sound effects on the album. Just the water flowing, the wood creaking, it's all very lively. And tracks like Yet Another Movie and Round and Around are also instrumental tracks, or at least 99% instrumentals. The track Learning to Fly is a fantastic track in my opinion. I love the very bold, clashing instrumentals of the track. The melodies and the chorus, they are soaring in the sky, they are bright, and they are loud. The choir vocals are fantastically fit onto the track as well. The track The Dog of War is also a really interesting sounding track. It constantly chuggas the synths. They are really cold-blooded and stern, and they're constantly moving mechanically, and it's a very bitter and harsh track, and I love the tone of that. The track On the Turning Away is also a pretty good track in that it sounds like a gospel track, except it's very smooth and also very dense and saturated. The track Terminal Frost is actually pretty good as well in my opinion. Maybe it's because of how it's sandwiched between two very short experimental tracks called A New Machine, parts 1 and part 2, where there is nothing but David Gilmour's very icy vocals sounding robotic, basically auto-tuned. And then we have Terminal Frost, which is this very, very long intermission track. And I don't know why, even though the music on the track doesn't really wow me or anything, I think the elevator music quality of the track makes me kind of appreciate it for how patient it is and how it sort of creates an atmosphere where it sounds like we're in a waiting room of sorts. But what really steals the show for me on the album is the track Sorrow, which is easily my favorite track on the entire album. Also, in my opinion, one of the most underrated Pink Floyd tracks. While, yes, it's a very 80s sounding track, it sounds fantastic. It is yeah, Sorrow, it really lives up to its name. I mean, the track is grooving, it's driving, it's compelling. It's not like a very slow, quiet song or anything, but it sounds sad. It sounds sorrowful. It sounds bitter. The keyboards, they are really crispy and bold. I really, really enjoy that. The drums are very dramatic, and the very cold-blooded, icy vocals just make this track sound more painful. It's like this track is very remorseful. It's full of regret, and I like that a lot for some reason. So yeah, while still not a perfect album, I still enjoyed quite a bit. I'm feeling a strong 6, maybe to a light 7 out of 10. I'll go with a strong 6. Next album is The Division Bell in the year 1994. And yeah, it's been 7 years since A Momentary Lapse of Reason. And this time the trio is back, and they have come out with an album that is more cohesive than A Momentary Lapse of Reason, and more focused as well. However, it's still not as good as the Big Four, and not as good as some of the better Pink Floyd albums before the Big Four. What I kind of dislike about this album is that it is very atmospheric and moody. And I have nothing against atmospheric and moody music, but this album is a long one, and pretty much every single moment of this album is drenched in reverb, in a light bed of synths, and very dreary guitars and icy vocals. It's not very, interesting sounding. But there are actually a lot of good song ideas on this album that I enjoy a lot. The album opener, Cluster 1, is definitely more better intro than Signs of Life. The instrumentals that sort of builds up slowly is actually very beautiful in my opinion. The second track, What Do You Want From Me, is how do I say this? David Gilmour has achieved in making a song that sounds both angry and relaxing. And also, if you look at the album cover, you'd see that it's basically two metallic statues looking at one another. This album is about division, but also about communication, and it's sort of inspired by Roger Waters and David Gilmour just hating one another, or more like Roger Waters against the world, basically. And this track shows how David Gilmour is angry towards Roger Waters. And it's a very late 80s vibe, mid-paced track, very reverby, very simplistic in structure as well. The track pulls apart as a 7-minute long, sweet, smooth, country folk flavored ballad with really beautiful, watery running guitars. And towards the second half of the track, we would get this really weird, sour, disorienting circus breakdown, which is really interesting. The track Marooned actually lives up to its title as well, because listening to this track, I really feel like I'm being marooned. I'm being exiled, and I'm in the middle of nowhere right now. And again, very dreary, and I do love that vibe, even though, again, throughout the entire album, that's pretty much the vibe. The track Wearing the Inside Out is a very special track. It is a mid-paced track. The melodies are actually kind of sticky, and this track is the first track in a long time where Richard Wright sings, and that's pretty interesting. What's more interesting is the track Keep Talking with the Stephen Hawking samples, and of course this track is about communication, and I actually love how driving the instrumentals are, and the choir vocals, they are fantastically fit into the track as well. Of course, my favorite on the album is High Hopes, of course. Again, another really tragic and bittersweet ending to the album. Except different from Sorrow, High Hopes is it's more lenient on the sad, tragic side than the groovy side. Yeah, it sounds really friggin' sad, but the tone of the synths and the guitars on this track, as well as the pianos, they have a really strong vibe to them. like it's like very concentrated tea. That's how I would describe that tone. It's like tea, but very, very, very concentrated. So you drink it, it's very bitter, but it's not like a punch in the face bitter. Not like someone had died kind of bitter, but like strong tea kind of bitter. Yeah, light 7 out of 10. I forgot to say what's my favorite track. My favorite track on Division Bell is High Hopes. My favorite track on A Momentary Lapse of Reason is Sorrow. My favorite track on the final cut is The Gunner's Dream, which then move over to Pink Floyd's last studio album, The Endless River, released 2 decades after The Division Bell. 2 decades. Released in 2014. And yeah, this album is not like a comeback album or anything. It's more like a collection of leftovers, song ideas, just instrumental tracks. The album is mostly instrumentals. And yeah, while it's very underwhelming, it's not a very impressive comeback. Instrumentally speaking, there are a few tracks on the album that are actually pretty good, but only a few, because every other track, again, because the song ideas and the instrumentals on The Endless River are basically leftovers from the Division Bell recording sessions. So, of course, very dreary, very atmospheric, nothing all that special or outstanding. Nick Mason only showed up on 2 tracks on the album, Some and Skins. And before the release of this album, Richard Wright had tragically passed away. Also, around 6 years prior to the release of this album, Pink Floyd had actually come together for a couple of times. There were a couple of reunions. So a lot had happened between The Endless River and Division Bell. Yeah, there's not much else to say about The Endless River. Again, the track Some is one of the better tracks here. It's more flavorful, it's more lively. I love the drums. The track Skins is definitely my favorite here. It is a very round, robust, echoey drum piece where the drums are constantly sort of chugging and banging, and it has this very strong experimental vibe to it. The track On Noodle Street is one of the more interesting tracks here. It's a very fun, relaxing, laid-back guitar doodle play. And the track Allen's Why, there are 2 tracks called Allen's Why, and in between those tracks it's Autumn 68, which reminds me a lot of a Summer 68 off of Atom Heart Mother. And these tracks, while they're not really all that great, they flow together very smoothly and they're coherent. And other than that, there really isn't much to explore on the album. The track Anacina is a very bland piano track with a little saxophones. The track Talkin' Hawking is, of course, a reference to Keep Talking. And the ending of the album, Louder Than Words, is a full, complete track. And it's a very gentle, slow rock song. It's very Pink Floyd-y. It's very Pink Floyd-y. This is the most Pink Floyd sounding Pink Floyd track ever because of its slow, bold instrumentals and all that. Except there really isn't anything all that special about this track that wows me or anything. So it's kind of an underwhelming ending to the album. But yeah, again, what more can you ask for? It's just a bunch of leftovers. So yeah, feeling like a strong 5 to a light 6 on The Endless River. And my favorite track here is Skins. So what are your thoughts on these 4 albums, as well as the entirety of the Pink Floyd discography? From 1 to 10, how much did you rate them? Like if you like them, hate if you hate them, and subscribe if you want more. And thanks for watching.